Hi, I'm Stephanie Chadwick, and I teach art history at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. I'm happy to present at the 2020 Southeast College Art Conference, and I'm glad we've been able to adapt to this year's unprecedented challenges. My paper is titled with a question, Scrap the Survey, Teaching Art History with Local and Global Resonance. The spirit of questioning and of adapting to provide more accessible, locally engaging, and globally resonant learning environments guides this talk. In my teaching and research, I specialize in modern and contemporary art. Like many art historians, however, I also teach art appreciation and the art history survey, in my case, art since the Renaissance. I do not teach art history majors, since our department serves undergraduates in art studio, design, and art education. I do have students who go on to graduate school in art history or who enter MFA programs, where they hone their crafts and prepare to publish or exhibit their work. Many of these alumni will teach university students themselves, or teach in primary, secondary, or museum education roles. Since most of these students will deal in one way or another with the very issues discussed in today's session, how best to recognize important global contributions to the history of art, and how to acknowledge the politics of display that have often determined what gets seen and where, it is often easy to get these students interested. This is not to say, however, that they all know that they should be interested. Many of them do not. Or they have an inkling at the beginning and become so fascinated along the way that they choose to focus their own work in these directions. But some students, especially in art appreciation and in intro survey courses, require some convincing about the need to study art history altogether. Thus, engaging students with local and global art is also the focus of this talk. As universities strive to engage diverse student bodies and ever more global and virtual interaction, many art historians are likewise experimenting with strategies to expand the survey to include more work by artists and cultures that have been underrepresented or misrepresented in the art historical canons. At the same time, we wonder, how can we do justice to the newly added content while still providing budding artists, art historians, and art educators with the foundational knowledge of the Western canons that guided art academies and, directly or indirectly, through pedagogy or its negation, informed the production of the past and even of today. How can we demonstrate the relevance of these histories to 21st century students, many of whom have chosen to focus on wider issues in visual and virtual culture in their work? Where do local practices that have, at least until fairly recently, been as neglected as global art fit within new pedagogical strategies? For many of us, and even when our programs are being updated for inclusiveness, the questions remain. What to keep, what to cut, and what to add? And where does that leave the survey? Should we scrap it? By now, I should clarify that after experimentation and careful consideration, I've determined that I'm not yet ready to scrap the survey. I have been close to doing so, and in some cases have tried, for example in my art appreciation and global perspectives courses, to use a thematic rather than linear historical approach. It works well in my global perspectives class, where I teach a contemporary course on artists exploring themes like time, history, and gender to mostly seniors who have already taken many of their required hours of art history and have some historical context and frames of reference for the works of art we see. I am less happy with a thematic approach for the art appreciation or intro art history classes. I like the idea in theory, and I have friends and colleagues who love the approach and regularly use it. In my attempts, however, I've found that the lack of temporal, and yes, some kind of fairly linear structure has left some students confused about historical, if better informed about cultural contexts. The trick, it seems to me, is to find a way to combine and adapt structures to expose students to both the history of art and its present reception, to present a history of art history that resonates with 21st century students. This paper addresses the benefits of adapting the art history survey to include both local and global art in ways that demonstrate the relevance of both the canons and its casualties. I feel that despite major progress, in some ways we are still just on the cusp of determining the best course of action when, as James Elkins famously proclaimed in his 2007 Art History as a Global Discipline, art and art history are fields, indeed words and concepts, that have been infused with Eurocentric biases since the inception of their respective disciplines in European academies. Elkins and other scholars have elaborated the many ways that what we call art is not a set of coherent practices, but instead varies according to both cultural and historical contexts. Indeed, as Carolyn Dean notes in The Trouble with the Term Art, much of what today is called art was not even made as art, and many cultures have no such concept and have considered all such cultural production to be functional, no matter how well designed. Of course, scholars such as Robert S. Nelson and others have discussed the ways in which art history textbooks and course syllabi tend to re-articulate the very ordering operations of Western hegemony. No doubt, creative solutions to this problem are being explored in earnest in the 21st century context in which educators seek to redress the omissions, underrepresentations, and egregious misrepresentations of outdated Eurocentric and frankly colonialist approaches. For me, one of the best ways to begin to address these problems is to simply acknowledge them, as we do in many graduate programs. By acknowledging this and the fact that we are always ourselves learning how best to proceed, we include students in the discussions about correcting course and about the stakes involved. What is the dilemma? Some students want to know. Some have asked if we could talk more about a particular subject, the art of India, for example, and some have suggested that we teach entire courses on such material. I agree, I say, but in reality such a course, though I have taught one previously in an art history department, would not be practical in a department such as ours, where I am one of 2 art historians serving art design and art education, not art history majors. How about a course in feminist art, they ask? That could probably stay on our books as a special topic within our current rotation system. But in reality, outside of my senior level global perspectives in contemporary art, all of my courses are surveys of one level or another. And I must continue teaching my upper division surveys, the history of modernism and the history of photography, for example, that our department sees as crucial to the successful instruction of studio majors who also have the option to take a survey of non-Western art with my colleague. So I continue to tweak the courses I have, to take out, rearrange, and replace the puzzle pieces to create a more diverse yet cohesive semester narrative and overall course of study. On the level of content adjustments, I've found that it's not often feasible to devote large blocks of time to additional bodies of work without feeling that I'm cutting everything too short or cutting too much of what I thought was need-to-know information. This is not to say that I do not cut. In fact, there are periods I spend much time cutting as a way of creating, to open the field to additional content and engaging activities. Still, the question arises, how much more can I cut and have this remain a survey that balances breadth and depth? At the same time, I wonder, how can I include not only more global content, but also more of the local and regional art that is so important and empowering for our students to know, yet is also underappreciated or ignored by the canons? How can I create active and significant learning experiences in the spirit and methods outlined by D. Fink and other pedagogical scholars in the domain of art history? Finally, how can I connect students of diverse backgrounds with local art and its histories in ways that include, yet surpass, standard museum engagement to encompass a wider appreciation of empowering role models and resources for undergraduate and postgraduate success? Although I have dabbled in thematic approaches, I remain, at least for now, engaged with the art historical survey in some form or another. I have scrapped traditional textbooks in most courses, however. For art appreciation, I edited and contributed to a collective department textbook that's organized by the histories of each medium and in which each chapter links to the history of the other and includes local and global production, as well as student and faculty work. In this and other courses, I also use free resource articles and engaging videos on websites such as Smart History and the PBS Art Assignment. I draw pedagogical inspiration from these and other sources, including the Art History Teaching Resources website. I have also begun to more fully utilize campus and community museums and galleries in ways that align with the topics most relevant to my courses and to students thinking of visual art careers in our region. Since most of these resources provide both in-person and virtual access, they've become even more relevant during the pandemic learning context, in which we aim to both provide safe learning and encourage community engagement. I'm also adding a new museum learning class that will foster critical thinking about local and global connections through object and context-based learning experiences that help students prepare for internships and postgraduate positions. I believe art history study is particularly suited to promoting higher order thinking in the areas of human dimension, caring, and learning how to learn. Opinions that are supported by a National Art Education Association and Association of Art Museum Directors study of the museum experience on primary school students. With these ideas and goals in mind for my university students, I decided to also take a lesson from Fink's Taxonomy of Significant Learning and some of the visual artists we studied. Thinking about backwards course design, in which we ask ourselves what we want to empower our students to accomplish, I've also started backing into art history through the lens of global contemporary art. The first time I started my Survey 2 module on Asian art with photos of Ai Weiwei dropping priceless Chinese vases, I could tell I had gotten my students' attention. The energy was palpable as they put down their phones and leaned forward in their chairs, whispering to each other their surprise or indignation at the transgression they were seeing on the screen. With that one short clip, I had not only gotten their attention, but also introduced that our topic would be Asian art and that would include discussion of colonialism, commodification, and globalist consumerism, as well as the politics of collecting and display. Showing PBS's The Case for Ai Weiwei also prompted my students to make connections between Weiwei's work and artists such as Andy Warhol, and to see in nearly real-time practice the relevance of art history to contemporary art. I knew I had found a winning strategy for my studio and design majors, who seemed to appreciate the interventionist nature of both the artist and our revitalized art history class. Following on the heels of the Weiwei success, we began our Intro to the Art of the Americas with the photo and video of Guillermo Gomez Peña. The photograph of this politically active performance artist dressed in the attire of a Mexican wrestler and a matador with text scrawled on his bare chest pleading, "Please don't discover me again," struck a chord. This was particularly so among my Latinx students who were starting to engage in political activism on campus and in their own art. At once, we knew we were in a discussion not only of art in the Americas, but the history of colonialism, its histories and policies in the Americas as well. Plus, students saw once again that art history is not only relevant, but an integral part of the practice of contemporary artists making both artistic and political statements. The stakes were high. Art history was not just a class students simply had to take to fulfill their requirements for studio design or art education degrees. It was a site in which they could investigate art's potential. In the hopes of increasing relatability and the visibility of the diversity in our own classroom, I started showing the art of our graduates who are pursuing work along similar lines, inviting alumni to talk about their experiences. And here, I show 2017 graduate Gonzalo Alvarez, who created the internationally acclaimed video game Borders and who's completing a series of graphic novels based on Mexican folklore. I have also been excited by responses to using recent or well-known exhibitions to begin, enliven, and refocus our class discussions of art history. A great example of this has been Making Africa, an exhibition curated by the Vitra Design Museum and the Guggenheim Bilbao that traveled to the US and that many of our faculty saw at the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas. Inserting key exhibitions into our discussions of art history has been an effective way to get students thinking about museum practices and how museums and art history classes can address issues that resonate with students and reinforce the idea that art plays a crucial role in informing and transforming beliefs and practices. Making Africa gets my students' attention. Seeing such work also prepares students to explore some of the art of Africa that we can cover in the short time available to us in class. Importantly, such approaches have led to class discussions about diversity, representations of history, colonialism, and Pan-African cultural pride, as well as to interdisciplinary campus activities. I believe that introducing this and other such globally engaged art into the classes demonstrates to students that art museums are not merely homes to the relics of art history, but instead vibrant learning resources at the students' disposal as they think about their own artistic futures. Trying these approaches to backing into art history and its issues has also emboldened me to experiment with multiple approaches within the same course and even on the same day. One example is having a breakout session on portraiture and politics within an otherwise temporal coverage of art, revolution, and empire since the Enlightenment. Indeed, to examine the very term Enlightenment and to consider how artists have represented, responded to, and critiqued related discourses. The work of Kehinde Wiley and the Brooklyn Museum of Art exhibition Jacques-Louis David Meets Kehinde Wiley has been one way to do this. As is eloquently stated on the museum's website, seen together, the works by David and Wiley reveal how race, masculinity, power, and representation layer onto portraiture and shape the writing of history. What better way to get students looking at art history and talking about its issues and continued relevance to today's art and cultural concerns? Combining these approaches, I have also begun using virtual and actual museum visits and online documentation to show how our local and regional museums tackle these same issues of providing access to art histories and diverse cultural representations. A recent example was the exhibition Black Paintings, which highlighted some of the key works of Houston artist David McGee at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas. With characteristic deftness, McGee's many works in the show created a visual context that combined elements of formalism with political activism, drawn from his experiences and identities as both an African American and a contemporary visual artist. It thus highlighted for my students the power of drawing upon a rich repertoire of art historical sources and contemporary experiences to create culturally and politically impactful art. McGee's work is internationally renowned. Yet examining the work of this Houston-based artist in our Regional Art Museum of Southeast Texas, whether in person or now virtually on the museum's website, gives students insights into the diversity and significance of art produced and exhibited in our region. It is indeed an empowering show. Taking a cue from the premises of the McGee exhibition, students have become interested in discussing the many issues it raises, including the need to examine art world and art historical practices to foster a greater sense of inclusion. On the one hand, backing into art history reveals works and issues that have been underappreciated by art historical canons. On the other hand, it helps students learn to appreciate that even famous artists at different periods in history have had both local and international audiences. Many of my students are excited to learn, for example, that artist Robert Rauschenberg hailed from down the street from us in Port Arthur, Texas. Or to realize that they can see John Bigger's empowering murals of African American cultural life at Texas Southern University, the University of Houston downtown, and other regional institutions that can be visited in a day trip from our home institution. Seeing works such as these has led students to guide our discussions to the art of underrepresented populations and the importance of the activist artists of each generation who have helped to turn that around. Bringing such works into our classes provides a lens through which we can look at other artworks in local and regional collections that students can easily access in terms of both proximity and cultural connections, and that we can discuss in relation to the artists covered in our course readings and videos. Indeed, embracing the idea that local is the new global, the title of a recent art newspaper webinar, including exhibitions and works such as these in the curriculum pays attention to the diversity that can be seen in different points of the history of art and the kinds of treasures that can be appreciated right around the corner, in addition to those that can be seen by traveling or virtually accessing the museums of the world. There is still much to be done, yet the forward-thinking work of these and other artists, curators, and educators have opened up worlds of possibility to reconfigure and revitalize the survey and to provide a context for thinking through new or hybrid learning possibilities to meet the needs of today's diverse students. We are already reaping the rewards along the way as we enliven our conversations about art history and diverse local and global practices.